The night I died, my wife wept, but not for me. She wept because the man she cheated on had turned her perfect little affair into a ticking time bomb, and now there was no escape from the fallout. Hey Reddit, my name's Anthony Wilson, and up until a year ago, I was living what I thought was a picture-perfect life. I had a job I loved, chemistry nerd here, hi, a cozy suburban home, and Sarah, my wife of 15 years, who I thought adored me as much as I adored her. Turns out, I was living in a Hallmark card, one of those that looks great on the outside but has a typo in the message when you open it. Let me give you some background. I'm what you'd call a quiet overachiever. I don't flaunt my successes, but I know my stuff. I'd made a name for myself in the niche but lucrative world of industrial chemistry. I was that guy who'd spend hours perfecting a formula and still come home in time to cook dinner. Sarah, meanwhile, worked in HR for Harris Industries, a company run by Robert Harris, a man with the charisma of a used car salesman and the ego of a tech billionaire. Now, I'm not the jealous type. Really, I'm not. I was perfectly happy letting Sarah have her life, her job, and even her work friends. But when your wife starts coming home late and smelling like expensive cologne when you don't own, you start asking questions. It wasn't just the cologne. It was the laughter I overheard on late-night phone calls. The vague work emergencies that always seemed to happen on Fridays. And then, there was her new business wardrobe. Sarah always looked great, but who buys designer dresses for a desk job? Still, I told myself I was overthinking it. Sarah had been there for me through thick and thin, and I wasn't about to start doubting her because of a few late nights. That is, until the night I overheard her on the phone in the kitchen. I can't wait for tomorrow night, she whispered. What's tomorrow night? I asked casually from the doorway, making her jump like a kid caught raiding the cookie jar. Oh, just a client dinner, she stammered, refusing to meet my eyes. Red flag? More like a whole parade. The next day, instead of heading straight to work, I decided to swing by her office. Call it a hunch, call it the slow-building paranoia of a man who's watched too many spy thrillers. What I found wasn't exactly shocking. Her car was in the parking lot, but so was Robert Harris's, parked right beside it in the farthest corner of the lot. Now, if you've never seen Robert, let me paint you a picture. He's the kind of guy who enters a room and immediately makes you want to check your wallet. Tall, tanned, and perpetually smirking like he's in on a joke you'll never get. He's got the confidence of a man who's never been told, no, you can't do that. He's also married, by the way, to a woman whose name I didn't even bother to learn because she clearly wasn't the one occupying his attention. That night, I followed Sarah's client dinner story to a 5-star restaurant downtown. From across the street, I watched her walk in on Robert's arm, laughing like he was the funniest man alive. It wasn't just a friendly dinner. There was body language, leaning in close, touching his arm, that kind of thing. I knew. I just knew. So what does a man do when he finds out his wife is cheating? Some cry, some drink, some yell. Me? I did what any rational, emotionally stable person would do. I started planning my fake death. Okay, let me explain. Confronting Sarah outright felt too easy. Too clean. And honestly, I wasn't interested in giving her or Robert the satisfaction of knowing they'd hurt me. No, I wanted to play this smart. I wanted them to regret every smug look, every stolen kiss, every whispered lie. And I had the skills to pull it off. Here's the thing about being a chemist, you spend your whole life learning how to make things appear and disappear. Reactions, compounds, even people, at least on paper. I'd been working on an experimental project involving a controlled chemical reaction that simulated an explosion. All it would take was some careful setup, a little misdirection, and voila, Anthony Wilson would be dead. The hardest part wasn't the science. It was pretending everything was normal. Every morning, I kissed Sarah goodbye like nothing was wrong. Every night, I asked her how her day was and pretended not to care when she mumbled something vague. Meanwhile, I was in the lab, setting the stage for my grand finale. Looking back, maybe it was extreme. Maybe I could have handled things differently. But when you've been betrayed by the one person you trusted most, logic takes a backseat to vengeance. This wasn't just about getting even. This was about rewriting the narrative, taking control of a story that had spiraled out of my hands. So, yeah. I faked my death. And I made sure it was a spectacle no one would forget. You ever think about what people would say at your funeral? I don't recommend dwelling on it, but it's a thought that hit me like a ton of bricks the night I finalized my plan. It wasn't just about vanishing, it was about leaving the kind of mark that would make Sarah and Robert feel the weight of what they'd done. First, I needed a convincing setup. Thankfully, my lab was the perfect stage. A chemist's workspace is like a magician's hat, full of surprises, most of which go boom if you're not careful. I'd spent weeks planning every detail. The key was to create just enough chaos to leave a believable trace of Anthony Wilson behind while ensuring no one looked too closely at the aftermath. That accident happened on a quiet Wednesday night. Most of the team had gone home, and I made sure to stay late, as I often did, tinkering with what I told everyone was a complex synthesis project. It wasn't entirely a lie, I was synthesizing the perfect disappearance. Here's how it went down. I set up a controlled explosion using a blend of chemicals I knew would leave enough scorch marks to convince anyone I'd been caught in the blast. I rigged my workstation to catch fire immediately after the reaction, ensuring no evidence of my survival would be left behind. I planted traces of my DNA, some hair, a bit of blood from a strategically nicked finger. Nothing too dramatic, but enough to pass the forensic sniff test. At precisely 9:14 p.m., I triggered the reaction. The sound was deafening, even though I was safely tucked away in a reinforced storage room I'd prepped earlier. The fire suppression system kicked in within seconds, but not before the flames had done their job. From there, I slipped out through a back exit, dressed in plain clothes, with a carefully packed duffel bag. I watched from a distance as the fire trucks arrived, followed by the police. My heart was pounding, and not from the thrill. This wasn't some movie scene. It was messy, terrifying, and altogether surreal. The news broke the next morning: tragic lab accident claims life of brilliant chemist. The words hit me harder than I expected. Seeing my picture plastered on the TV, hearing colleagues talk about how dedicated and kind I was. It was like attending my own eulogy. Sarah's reaction was another thing altogether. I expected tears, maybe guilt, but what I saw was complicated. Sure, she cried when the reporters showed up at our house, but behind those tears was something I couldn't quite place. Was it relief? Fear? Or just the raw panic of realizing her secret life might come to light? Robert, of course, stayed in the shadows. He didn't show up at the house to comfort Sarah, not publicly, anyway. But I had no doubt they were in touch. With the world convinced I was dead, I began phase 2, becoming the ghost that would haunt them. My first step was disappearing completely. No credit cards, no phones, no traceable connections. I had a stash of cash, a burner phone, and a new identity ready to go. Goodbye, Anthony Wilson. Hello, Mark Grayson, a nondescript man with no past and no particular future. Living off the grid wasn't glamorous. I rented a small cabin in the woods a few towns over, surviving on microwave meals and internet from a cafe a mile down the road. Most of my time was spent planning my next move. The beauty of faking your death is the freedom it gives you. You can watch your enemies unravel without lifting a finger. And unravel they did. Sarah couldn't hide the cracks in her facade for long. The reporters eventually moved on, but her co-workers didn't. Whispers about Robert Harris's late-night visits started to circulate. The best part? I was the one who started those whispers. From my new hideout, I created an anonymous email account and sent a tip to one of Sarah's colleagues, someone I knew had a nose for gossip. Robert Harris spotted leaving the Wilson house late at night. Coincidence? Or something more? It was petty, sure, but oh, so satisfying. By the time the rumor reached their office, it had evolved into full-blown speculation. I wasn't there to see it, but I could imagine the looks on their faces, the tension, the denials, the excuses. But I wasn't done. No, this was just the beginning. I've always loved puzzles. Chemistry itself is one big puzzle, tiny, invisible pieces fitting together in ways that either create something amazing or cause catastrophic failure. So, when it came to my revenge, I treated it like a complex chemical reaction. I had all the raw materials, anger, betrayal, and just enough forensic know-how to turn whispers into explosions. The target? Robert Harris, the man who treated the rules of the world like they were guidelines for other people. And Sarah? Well, she was collateral damage, part of the equation whether I liked it or not. The first thing I needed was evidence. Robert wasn't just a smarmy businessman, he was a smarmy businessman with a long history of shady dealings. You don't rise to the top of a company like Harris Industries by playing nice. Over the years, I'd overheard Sarah mention things about questionable vendors and unexpected bonuses. Back then, I chalked it up to corporate gossip. Now, I saw it as breadcrumbs leading me to a treasure trove of incrimination. The trick was getting my hands on it without leaving a trail. My new Mark Grayson identity came in handy here. From the anonymity of my hideout, I hacked into a few unsecured accounts, nothing too fancy, just enough to access emails and files that most people were too lazy to encrypt. Robert was as reckless with his digital footprint as he was with his personal life. His inbox was a gift that kept on giving. Email chains about inflated contracts, just bump the numbers. They won't notice. Offshore accounts, payments rerouted through enough countries to make James Bond blush. Bribes disguised as consultation fees, a trail so obvious it might as well have been highlighted in neon. But the piece de resistance? A series of transfers from Harris Industries to a shell company owned by, you guessed it, Robert's cousin, which then funneled back into Robert's personal account 6 months later. The guy wasn't even creative about it. Now came the hard part, tying Sarah into this mess. Look, I wasn't trying to destroy her out of spite. But let's be real, she chose Robert over me. And whether she knew about his schemes or not, she was part of his world now. I fabricated a series of emails between Sarah and Robert that made her look like a willing participant. It wasn't hard. I knew her tone, her writing style, and even the little quirks she used in emails, like signing off with best Sarah instead of just Sarah. I made it look like she was helping Robert approve shady contracts and shuffle funds around. My crowning achievement? A fake email where Sarah advised Robert to keep a certain transaction off the books, ending with, "Just make sure this doesn't come back to bite us." Poetry, really. With my evidence compiled, it was time to release the hounds. I sent the entire package, emails, financial records, and a whistleblower letter, to 2 places, the local news and law enforcement. The media response was immediate and brutal. Harris Industries CEO under investigation for financial misconduct was splashed across every major outlet. Reporters dug into Robert's past faster than you can say offshore account, and within days, his empire began to crumble. Sarah wasn't spared, either. While Robert took the brunt of the fallout, her name appeared in enough reports to raise eyebrows. The fabricated emails were a stroke of genius, adding just enough doubt to her character without making her the main focus. She was placed on administrative leave at work, which is corporate speak for, we're deciding whether to fire you or let you quit quietly. The best part? I didn't have to do a thing once the ball started rolling. The system worked its magic, and all I had to do was sit back and watch. Robert went into full damage control, releasing statements about misunderstandings and errors in judgment. But it was too late. His face was everywhere, from news reports to social media memes. My personal favorite? A picture of him next to the caption, "When you play Monopoly but forget to read the rules." Sarah, on the other hand, tried to keep a low profile. I heard through a mutual friend that she was distraught and didn't understand how this was happening. She stayed home most days, fielding calls from colleagues and reporters, and probably wondering if Robert was worth all this trouble. For a while, I felt invincible. I'd done it. I'd exposed the truth, brought a corrupt man to his knees, and made Sarah regret every lie she'd ever told me. But here's the thing about revenge, it's addictive, but it doesn't satisfy. At first, the chaos was thrilling. Watching their lives unravel felt like justice. But as the days turned into weeks, something started gnawing at me. Sure, I destroyed them. But what had I built for myself? I was living in a borrowed cabin under a fake name, with no real connection to the world. My death was a constant weight on my chest and isolation that even the sweetest revenge couldn't fix. I'd given up everything to play puppet master, and now the strings were starting to tangle. And then came the whispers, the ones in my own head, asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. Was it worth it? Could I ever go back? And most haunting of all, what kind of person had I become? If bringing Robert Harris down was my goal, then I had succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. His empire didn't just crumble, it detonated. The media had a field day with the scandal, plastering his face and name across every screen and headline. His history of shady dealings became public knowledge overnight, from offshore accounts to fraudulent contracts. It seemed like every journalist in the city was fighting to unearth the next damning detail. The board of directors wasted no time in distancing themselves from him. By the end of the week, he was ousted from his position, officially stepping back to focus on personal matters. The statement was laughable, given that his personal matters involved dodging reporters camped outside his mansion. Last I heard, he'd locked himself inside with his lawyer and a rapidly dwindling supply of dignity. Sarah, though not the headline act, didn't escape unscathed. The emails I'd planted worked like a charm, tying her to Robert's fraudulent activities in just enough detail to tarnish her reputation. Her co-workers began avoiding her, whispers spread in the office, and she was swiftly placed on administrative leave. It was a corporate purgatory she couldn't fight. I thought I'd feel triumphant. I waited for the rush of satisfaction, the sense of victory. But it didn't come. Instead, there was a strange hollowness that grew with each passing day. One night, I stumbled upon a news clip of Sarah outside her house, ambushed by a reporter. She looked disheveled, a far cry from the polished, composed woman I used to know. The reporter shoved a mic in her face, asking if she had any comment on the allegations. I didn't know," she stammered. Her voice cracked, and she fought to hold back tears. "I swear, I didn't know what he was doing." I froze, staring at the screen. This was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? To see her squirm, to watch her feel the weight of everything she'd done to me. And yet, seeing her like that, it didn't feel the way I thought it would. I found myself remembering the woman I fell in love with. The Sarah who laughed at my terrible chemistry puns and once stayed up all night helping me prepare for a conference, even though she had work in the morning. Was this the same person? Had she changed, or had I? The more I thought about it, the more I started to unravel. For weeks, I had been so consumed by my revenge that I hadn't considered what came after. Watching Robert's empire collapse was thrilling at first, but now the excitement was gone. I was left with the weight of what I had done, and the silence of my isolated life. Doubt crept in, insidious and relentless. What if Sarah hadn't known about Robert's crimes? The emails I'd forged were damning, but what if they were lies layered over an already broken truth? She had betrayed me, yes, but did that justify everything I'd done to her? I began to second-guess every decision I'd made since the night I staged my death. The anger that had fueled me was gone, replaced by guilt and an ache I couldn't shake. I realized I wasn't just living off the grid to avoid being discovered. I was hiding from them, from myself, from the consequences of my actions. One morning, unable to sleep, I sat at my desk and started writing a letter. I didn't know what I hoped to accomplish, but I couldn't stop myself. I told Sarah everything. I confessed to faking my death, to framing her and Robert, and to orchestrating the entire downfall. I poured out my anger, my pain, and even the small flicker of regret that had started to grow inside me. When I finished, the letter was 3 pages long, the words messy and raw. I folded it up, stared at the envelope for a long time, and then threw it into the wood stove. I wasn't ready. Writing the letter didn't fix anything, but it felt like the first step towards something I couldn't quite name. Redemption? Forgiveness? Maybe just the simple act of facing what I'd done. The fallout of my revenge was complete. Robert's empire was in ruins, and Sarah's life was in shambles. But as I sat in that cabin, alone with my thoughts, I realized something I hadn't considered before. In tearing them apart, I'd also torn myself apart. Now, I had to figure out how to put the pieces back together. A year after my death, I had grown accustomed to being a ghost. No one knew I was alive, and I intended to keep it that way at least until I figured out what to do with the tangled mess I created. But every ghost has its haunt, and mine was Sarah. Despite everything, I couldn't stop checking in on her. Maybe it was guilt, maybe it was spite, or maybe some pathetic part of me still cared. Whatever the reason, I created a ritual of scrolling through her social media under a fake account, piecing together fragments of her life like a detective on a cold case. Most of her posts had been quiet lately, pictures of sunsets, a few with friends, and vague captions about starting fresh. But one day, a new post stopped me cold. It was a photo of Sarah at a cafe, her smile soft, her eyes bright. Sitting across from her, barely visible in the frame, was a man's hand resting lightly on hers. The caption read, "New beginnings." The words burned into me like acid. Who was he? How dare she move on so quickly? And then, like a punch to the gut, I remembered, Sarah thought I was dead. Of course, she'd move on. That didn't make it hurt any less. I tried to shake it off, but the image haunted me. The next day, I did something reckless. I drove into the city and parked a few blocks from our old neighborhood. The cafe in the photo wasn't hard to find, and when I stepped inside, there she was. Sarah sat at a table near the window, laughing at something her companion had said. He was well dressed, with salt and pepper hair and a polished air that screamed steady and successful. The kind of man who probably didn't spend his nights plotting revenge in a remote cabin. I stayed outside, watching from a safe distance. They talked animatedly, their body language relaxed, their smiles genuine. She looked happy. It struck me that I hadn't seen her smile like that in years, even before the affair. After they left the cafe, I couldn't stop myself from following them. They strolled down the street, stopping at a bookstore where he picked out a novel and handed it to her. She laughed, a light, carefree sound that felt like a knife twisting in my chest. I told myself I should leave. This was none of my business anymore. But when they walked to a park and sat together on a bench under a sprawling oak tree, I stayed. And then it happened. The man leaned in, and Sarah met him halfway. Their kiss wasn't rushed or hungry, it was soft, lingering, the kind that speaks of something deeper. My heart clenched, and for a moment, I thought I might actually be sick. This was different from her affair with Robert. With Robert, it had been about status, power, excitement. But this? This looked real. For hours after, I couldn't shake the image of them together. The tenderness in her expression, the way she touched his hand like it was second nature, it was too much. I spent the night pacing my cabin, replaying every moment of our marriage, searching for answers I knew I wouldn't find. Had I been blind to her unhappiness? Was I too wrapped up in my work to notice the cracks forming between us? Maybe her affair with Robert wasn't just about him but about what I'd failed to give her. The thought gutted me. And yet, I couldn't let it go. The next day, I returned to the city. This time, I didn't follow her. I waited. I parked down the street from our old house and stayed in the shadows, watching as she left for her morning walk. My heart pounded as she rounded the corner, her earbuds in, her face serene. She hadn't changed much, but there was a lightness to her now, a freedom that hadn't been there when we were together. I stepped out of the shadows, my voice breaking the stillness. Sarah! She froze mid-step, her eyes snapping to mine. For a moment, she just stared, her expression a mix of confusion and disbelief. Then her hand flew to her mouth, and she whispered, Anthony? It's me, I said, my voice steady even though my chest felt like it might cave in. We need to talk. She didn't move. Her face went pale, her breathing shallow. You're supposed to be. I mean, they said you were. Dead? I finished for her. Yeah. That's what everyone thinks. Her knees buckled slightly, and she grabbed the fence beside her for support. What is this? Some kind of sick joke? It's not a joke, I said, stepping closer. I'm alive, Sarah. I've been alive this whole time. She looked at me like she was seeing a ghost, her eyes darting over my face, searching for answers I wasn't sure I could give. Why? She asked finally, her voice trembling. Why would you do this? I think you already know, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. You and Robert. Her face crumpled, a tear sliding down her cheek. Anthony, I don't even know where to start. Try the truth, I said. For once. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating, until she finally whispered, I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't cut it, Sarah, I said, my voice breaking. Not after everything. The wind stirred the leaves around us, carrying with it the weight of everything left unsaid. For the first time since my death, I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore: revenge, closure, or maybe just a reason to forgive her. But as we stood there, staring at each other, one thing was clear: this conversation was far from over. For days after revealing myself to Sarah, I couldn't shake the look on her face. Shock, confusion, guilt, it all played out in those few moments, and yet, the most haunting part was something else. Relief. Somewhere in her expression, I caught the faintest flicker of it, as if my reappearance brought closure to wounds she hadn't realized were still bleeding. We hadn't said much after that initial encounter. She begged me to give her time to process, and for reasons I didn't fully understand, I agreed. I told myself it was strategic, that I needed space to figure out my next move. But the truth? I was afraid of what I'd hear when she was ready to talk. A week later, the call came. "Meet me," she said, her voice tentative but resolute. She named a small park near the edge of the city, one we used to visit on lazy Sundays back when we still liked each other. I hesitated, but curiosity, and maybe something else, pulled me in. When I arrived, Sarah was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a massive oak tree. She looked different, not in the physical sense, but in the way she carried herself. There was a heaviness to her that hadn't been there before, like she'd spent the past week wrestling with demons she couldn't quite defeat. I sat down beside her, keeping a cautious distance. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the silence filled only by the sound of rustling leaves and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Finally, she broke the silence. "Why, Anthony? Why did you do it?" I laughed bitterly. "Why?" "Because you cheated on me, Sarah. Because you chose him over me. Because I needed you to feel even a fraction of the pain you put me through." She flinched but didn't look away. "I know I hurt you," she said softly. "But faking your death? Framing me? Do you even realize what that did to me? To us?" "You mean what you did to us," I snapped, the bitterness spilling over before I could stop it. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't let them fall. Instead, she took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Yes, I cheated. I won't make excuses for that. But do you even care why? Or are you so caught up in your revenge that the reasons don't matter?" I opened my mouth to fire back a retort but stopped. Did I care why? Part of me wanted to say no, to claim that her betrayal was black and white, but the truth was murkier. I'd spent months trying to piece together her motivations, and now that I was face to face with her, I realized I needed to know. "Fine," I said finally. "Why, Sarah? Why him?" She looked down at her hands, twisting her wedding ring, the one she still wore, despite everything. "Because I was lonely, Anthony," she said quietly. "You were always at the lab. Always working. I know you were doing it for us, for our future, but it felt like I wasn't part of your life anymore. And then Robert came along. He paid attention. He made me feel seen." I clenched my fists, the anger bubbling up again. "So your solution was to sleep with him? To throw away everything we built together?" "No," she said firmly, her voice shaking. "My solution was to try to talk to you, but you didn't hear me. I made a terrible choice, Anthony, but it wasn't about love or even lust. It was about filling a void I didn't know how to handle." The words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to yell at her, to tell her she was lying, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. I'd been distant. I'd poured everything into my work, assuming that Sarah would always be there, waiting, without realizing how much I was asking of her. But that didn't excuse what she'd done. "And the new guy?" I asked coldly. "What's his excuse?" She blinked, taken aback, before shaking her head. "Eric? He's not Robert, Anthony. He's just someone I met after you died. Someone kind. Someone safe." "Safe," I repeated, the word twisting in my gut. "And what happens when safe isn't enough anymore?" "I don't know," she admitted. "But I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to move forward." The honesty in her voice disarmed me. For the first time since my death, I felt the weight of everything I'd done, not just to Sarah but to myself. I'd burned my life to the ground to punish her, but all I'd really done was trap us both in the rubble. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said finally, my voice cracking. She looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know if I deserve it," she replied. "But I needed you to know the truth. All of it." We sat there in silence, the distance between us feeling both vast and strangely close. For the first time, I wasn't sure if revenge had been worth it. For weeks after our conversation in the park, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. Sarah's voice, her tears, the raw vulnerability in her words, it all stuck with me like a splinter I couldn't remove. I wanted to hate her, but the anger I'd clung to for so long had started to feel hollow. Instead of giving me closure, my revenge had left me with questions. What was I supposed to do now? Could I let go of the past, or was I doomed to keep circling it like a vulture? Then came the letter. It arrived one rainy afternoon, a plain white envelope with no return address. At first, I thought it might be a bill or junk mail, but when I opened it, my heart stopped. Anthony. I don't know if you'll even read this, but I had to try. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I don't expect you to give it. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry for everything I did to you, to us. I made mistakes I can't take back, and I'll carry the guilt of them for the rest of my life. But I also want you to know that I loved you. I still do. Maybe that doesn't mean much now, but it's the truth. You were my best friend, my partner, my everything. And even though I ruined that, I hope you can find a way to heal. I hope you can find happiness again. I don't know where we go from here, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here. Sarah. I read the letter 3 times, each word sinking into me like a weight. It wasn't the confession I expected, nor was it the clean slate I'd hoped for. It was something in between a plea for understanding, an olive branch extended into the unknown. For the first time, I felt the walls I'd built around myself begin to crack. I spent days wrestling with what to do. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to hold on to the anger and let it keep me safe. But another part, quieter but insistent, whispered that maybe this was a chance to start over, not as a husband or even as a friend, but as someone who could finally let go. One evening, on a whim, I found myself driving back to the city. I didn't have a plan or even a destination in mind, but somehow, I ended up outside Sarah's house. The lights were on, and through the window, I could see her sitting at the dining table, flipping through a photo album. She looked peaceful, almost content, and for a moment, I felt like a trespasser in a life that had moved on without me. I turned to leave but stopped when the door opened. Anthony, she said softly, her voice carrying through the rain. I froze, unsure of what to say. I didn't mean to bother you, I stammered. You're not bothering me, she said, stepping onto the porch. She hesitated, then added, do you want to come in? I almost said no. I should have said no. But instead, I found myself nodding. Inside, the house was warm and familiar, though some things had changed. New furniture, new photos on the walls. Still, it felt like stepping into a memory I hadn't realized I'd missed. We sat in the living room, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. Finally, she broke it. I didn't think I'd ever see you again, she admitted, her voice trembling. I didn't think I'd want to come back, I replied honestly. She looked at me, her eyes searching mine. Why did you? I hesitated, then sighed. Because. I don't know how to move forward. I thought revenge would fix everything, but it didn't. It just made me feel empty. She nodded slowly. I know the feeling. For hours, we talked. About the past, about the choices we'd made and the people we'd become. There were tears, apologies, and moments of silence that said more than words ever could. By the time I left, the rain had stopped, and the sky was beginning to clear. We didn't make any promises that night. There were no grand declarations or plans for reconciliation. But as I walked away, I felt lighter, like a weight I'd carried for far too long had finally been lifted. Sarah and I weren't the same people we'd been when we first fell in love. Maybe we never would be. But in that moment, I realized that healing wasn't about going back to what was. It was about finding a way to move forward, even if it meant walking separate paths. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could. Was Sarah's explanation of loneliness and feeling unseen a valid reason for her actions, or does it sound like an excuse? How do you think? Do you think Anthony and Sarah's relationship stands a chance of being rebuilt, or will the trust always be broken? Write in the comments what you think about this.